Morning, everybody, and welcome to Strategy Cafe. I'm just going to take a moment to let a few more people log in. And as we've been doing recently, I think it's quite nice just to take a bit of time at the start of a session like this to tune in. So if you don't mind following me, you don't have to, but I'm just going to take a few breaths and tune into the here and now and bring my attention into what I'm doing. So deep breath in. And a slow breath out. Another deep breath in. And a slow breath out. One more, and deep breath in. And just notice that you can shift your attention. You know, you can see out of the periphery of your eyes. You can hear, around yourself, and you can direct your attention to here and now and have an intention for this session, what you're going to learn from today, what you might ask from today, what you hope to get out of listening to our conversation this morning. One of the reasons why we do quick breath in, long breath out is the long breath out stimulates parasympathetic nervous system. So it just gives you that variability and flips you out of sort of fight, flight, alert into more of a relaxed state, which is quite cool and good for just turning us into listening mode. So morning, everybody. Really nice to see you. Welcome to Strategy Cafe. We're going to be talking this morning with Matt Meyer. I'm going to introduce Matt in a second. I'm absolutely delighted to have him on the podcast this morning. And he's going to be talking us through lessons in leadership in big partnership in the law. I've known Matt, oh gosh, probably on and off for more than 10 years. And he's had an incredible experience, and he'll tell us all about how he and his colleagues have moved the firm forwards, and the barriers and things they had to overhaul to get to where they've got to today, and all about what's next. And we're going to be talking about sort of a balancing act, which I think both of us kind of really tune into around, organized strategy and the live nature of the firm, so identity, culture, personality, all that kind of stuff, and whether it's a straitjacket and how do you balance those things out. And then a little bit of questions to Matt about, at this point in his leadership career, kind of what next for the firm, what next for him. So super interesting. And then at the top of the hour, we'll just talk to you about what we're going to be doing next. And then we've got 10 minutes or so for questions. So you will all know that there is a questions area on GoToWebinar. Really open to using that as chat. I think after this webinar, we're going to move on to doing it on Zoom because the chat is more open. But we're still in GoToWebinar this morning. So unfortunately, we can't have live chat, but you can use the questions area for that. And I really encourage you to do that. So any comments you've got, any thoughts you've got, anything you want to ask, even just observations, just pile them into the questions area and we'll use that as a chat box. And I'll pick up any questions that you've got and feed them to Matt as we go through. So I hope you enjoy it and look forward to engaging with you through the questions area. So Matt, welcome.
Hi, pretty good to be with you, Nick.
Really nice to have you on the podcast this morning. I'm absolutely delighted to have you here. So maybe just introduce everybody to you and give them a quick sort of background.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Matt. I'm Chief Exec at Taylor Vinters. Taylor Vinters is a law firm. If you'd asked us 5 years ago what we were, we'd have said we're aspiring to be a leading law firm for innovators and entrepreneurs. And if you asked us this morning, we'd say we're looking to be a catalyst in the innovation ecosystem, which is an evolution that perhaps sits under a story we can talk about later. But I'm a commercial technology IP lawyer by background, and have worked in the UK and abroad, and in big firms and little firms, and took up the reins as part of a management team at Taylor Vinters in 2008 and transitioned into a purely leadership role, probably more than a management role, and very much enjoying that, and very glad to be here and sharing my experiences, hoping they're relevant to some of you.
Fabulous. So here you are, it's you and Ed, and that's a fabulous introduction. People probably don't know too much about the inner workings of a partnership. But as we were discussing, both of you before you took it on were senior lawyers within the legal practice, influential, bringing in a lot of economic value. And then at some point you took this decision, I think it's together, to tell me if I'm right or not, but to sort of step into leadership. So just tell us a little bit about how that happened, and why did you do that, and what was that like, when you first sort of launched yourselves in this completely new direction?
It was an interesting period, actually. I mean, there was a lot going on in the market. So this was around 2007, 2008. So we were sort of just running into the banking crisis and Lehman's collapse. In legal services, there was a lot of deregulation going on, and the world looked pretty competitive, and it looked like an environment where we needed to evolve to survive. And that sounds a bit dramatic, but it's probably, with hindsight, true. We'll certainly survive with the degree of ambition that we've got. And we took a decision, which was it was all part of a competitive process. So law firms, like many partnerships, the leadership team is an elected position rather than a hired position. So we were in a competitive process to be the management team. And to cut a long story short, Ed and I realised reasonably early in that competitive process that we shared some very similar views on the way we thought the world was going and what we think we needed the business to do. And we came from completely different backgrounds. So Ed came from a litigation background. I came from a corporate commercial background. We worked in very different client markets. And what we realised was that actually we were stronger together. And we knew that the changes we needed to bring through the business were at a level that required us to really have the full backing of the partnership. And doing something together brought together the biggest constituency, so that the biggest constituency that could get really behind those changes we saw as necessary.
And so then you step forward and you're suddenly in this leadership role together. Tell us what that was like. What was your first experience of this? I guess it was a bit of a shock to the system to stop somehow being a lawyer and instead be a leadership team.
It was a lot of fun. I think that's how I remember the early days. I mean, there was a sort of naivety about the possibilities, and we were having a great time because the way the world was needed us to kind of move quickly. So it was a lot of fun, but on the other hand, it was as you alluded to, it was a massive adjustment. We were both very client focused, deliverable focused lawyers who are used to being right and spend their life trying to convince people that they're right, and advisory by nature, and built in a sort of advisory way, trained to opine on things, and suddenly you're in an environment where, frankly, that doesn't work. I mean, it's an environment where the game is about influence and recognizing the sort of shifting sands of power in the organization. What we learned very quickly is we needed to operate in a different way. I say very quickly, I mean, I think we probably had 18 months of finding it pretty hard adjusting from command and control to influence, and from deliverables to long-term programs with very few deliverables that were measurable. That was a big adjustment. And part of the story of the last nearly 12 years is really how long that took, but how important that transition was.
Yeah, really interesting. So I'm quite curious about that earlier point you made about being, I guess, the expert being always right. You might say being solutions focused. Clients come to you, they consult, don't they? And your job is to provide them with answers. So it's a huge mindset shift to do that. And this idea of empowering, it's like an easy thing to say, but very hard to really do properly. So what was your transition? How did you get there really quickly? And how did you know you were on the right path? And how did you discern that that's what you needed to do?
I think, I mean, it's interesting you say that about having the right answers. I think the truth of it is you have to move from trying to have the answers to trying to have the questions, and that's the adjustment. And to some extent, your professional training does help with that, but to another extent, you're in a professional partnership where actually influence is often about having the answers, not the questions. So how do we do that? Well, I think we recognised we'd become a reasonably significant bottleneck in the organisation about a year and a half in. I mean, we were, we were typical kind of lawyers. We were throwing ourselves on top of every grenade. We came out of every meeting with the longest to-do list, and that's how we've been rewarded in the past. And actually, we realised that wasn't working out, both personally and I think for the organisation. And to some extent, the fact that there were two of us, which was unusual in our business, and is still relatively unusual, certainly in a professional practice of our size, meant that we were taking a lot of things away, which in some ways was disempowering the broader organisation in partnership. So we felt that, we felt that change, and the fundamental thing that we did that changed that, and this was not our own good insight, this was on recommendation, was to actually take a coaching approach to how we led rather than a command and control approach. And both of us, over a period of about 18 months, went through professional training as coaches, and then tried to introduce that coaching culture into our own leadership approach, but also more broadly within the organisation. And as I'm sure many of you know, the heart of coaching is about asking the right questions, not always having the right answers. So that really helped. That was the turning point.
So interesting. And just while we're on this topic, I'm curious as to, so I think it's a really good idea to have the two roles. And just kind of just tuning into this with one of our current clients, we've just, working with a big family business. And, the question put to the next generation a couple of years back, it's not quite the same in professional practice, but it is intergenerational in a way, isn't it? Even though you're not a family, firms. I don't know when Taylor Vinters originally started. I guess it was a long time back, right? Maybe you know the date.
1989. So it was a merger of two firms in 1989. It was, which is pretty in our space is a reasonably long history.
Yeah. I remember actually for a law firm once that had been around for 240 years, and I think in that and this will make you laugh. In that entire time, they'd never had a balance sheet. They go. And one of the things that just absolutely I thought was fantastic was I said, well, how do you work out what to pay people when they leave? And he said, well, we don't know. We don't know what their partnership capital account is. We don't know what their income has been. That makes no sense. And you've got away with that for 250 years. But so these things are sort of intergenerational, even though they're not necessarily family businesses. So there is a similarity there. But the question my client was asked is, which one of you is going to be chief executive? And that's put the cat amongst the pigeons, because they all want to be chief executive. It's very difficult. So I know you guys resolved that question by election, because you've got a community you can go to, and you can kind of seek that mandate. So that's quite powerful, and it works really well, I think. We've taken them to them this idea of partnership, because actually when you're leading a really big business, it's incredible. It's an onerous responsibility. It can be great fun, but it's an onerous responsibility. So actually leading in partnership like you and Ed do, I think is a really good model, and it's very, very interesting. I'm just curious as to how you split the role. What is his role? What is your role? And how do you balance that and manage it, and what do you do together, as opposed to doing apart? Just tell us a bit about that.
I think the starting point is that what you call yourselves is irrelevant. Those titles are for stakeholder groups, whether they're internal or external. So I think that's the starting point. But fundamentally, why Ed and I work well together, this does come to your question, but why Ed and I work well together is because we have different and complementary skills, and a reasonably good sense of awareness, and a very strong personal relationship, which we didn't have before we worked together, but we developed, which allows us to be very fluid about that. So there's an element of what are you good at, there's an element of what's your role, there's an element of how much capacity you've got, and there's an element of who is it that you're needing to work with, because naturally you have different relationships with different people. So that's kind of the context to it. But to your question, when we started, the essential difference was that I was more outward focused, clients, commercial strategy, partnerships, international, and Ed was more inward focused, around finance and HR and managing the partners, operations, and also the kind of operational implementation of our strategy. And then right in the middle of those two things was a really strong overlap around strategy and how we articulate strategy. So that's where we started. I think as things have evolved and developed, it's become a bit more fluid, and we're both capable of doing bits of each other's original roles, and we basically do what works, underpinned by a really strong personal relationship. But we do have different skills. Ed often says that I sketch and he colours in, which is one way of looking at it, and that's an interesting approach that's worked so far. Perhaps in more traditional language, Ed's the finisher completer and very organised, and I'm not. So that's the ability to be comfortable with those strengths and weaknesses, I think is a really important part of making it work at a practical level.
It's a really nice self-effacing way of putting it, but I mean, also I feel like that's alluding to maybe you've got that slightly more big picture thinking to start with, and there is a need, I think, when you're thinking strategically and thinking about options to do that, and then also to fill in all of the steps and make that connection back. I think a really good way of working in a team at this level in the organization is to translate strategic thinking into tactical actions. And so that if the two of you can do that really well together, I guess you learn from each other. And I hear also there's it's now these days more about the dynamic of the relationship, knowing each other really well, and like you're both permanent understudies. So if one of you's not up, the other one can be up, which gives you a lot of resilience actually in your leadership, I would say.
Well, I think it's about the personal relationship between us, but it's also about the personal relationships we hold in the business. And I think there are essentially there are large parts. There's a much greater degree of overlap in what we do now than there was. We've learned from each other. I think that's probably fair to say. But also there are bits of our business or bits of our client base that we both feel more affinity to or excitement about, and it's natural to place your energy in those places that you're passionate about, really.
Yeah, so it gives you lots of optionality. So when we were chatting, I noticed that you had a photo behind you. I'm not here because we're speaking this morning from London to Italy, right? But and this isn't your cockpit, but tell us why you have a cockpit behind you in your office at home, and then let's get into why that's kind of relevant to leadership.
That cockpit's even older than the firm that you were referring to earlier. So why do I have a cockpit? So I think being an effective leader is about drawing on all of the different things that are in your life, and being a lawyer and being a partner in a law firm is one aspect of it. But I've also, my passion all of my life has been flying, and I think there are significant lessons that you can pull from other aspects of your life and bring them into how you operate as a leader. In my case, I draw a lot of parallels and inspiration from the way that flying works, how I operate in the cockpit, the culture, procedures. But I think that's equally relevant to anything else that people have got in their lives. And there's a lot of talk about bringing your whole self to work, and I think that's not about simply being at work all the time. I think that's some people have interpreted it that way. I think bringing your whole self to work is about bringing all the different experiences and inspirations you have in your life. And as a general proposition, and aviation is a great example of this, but I think there are many others. You can just see issues differently when you look at them through the lens of a different industry or a different different part of the world or a different culture. And as successful leaders, we should challenge ourselves to do that. It's all part of that kind of curiosity that makes for good leadership.
Yeah. So this morning I'm interviewing Matt Meyer, who's Chief Executive at Taylor Vinters, and I can see David, Wayne, Ashley listening in. So just to remind you, there's a questions area. So if as you're listening to us, to sort of discussing sort of aspects of Matt's leadership and experience in a law firm, just fire your observations and comments into the questions area, and we can pick those up as we go. Nice to see you all online this morning, and welcome to the podcast. In this context, we're talking a little bit about black box thinking, which is the airline industry's approach to avoiding catastrophic failures. And I think it does allude to that idea of free-flowing information. You know, when they examined why planes crashed, quite a lot of the reason was because there was too much status in the pilot. People felt difficulty in speaking to them necessarily. Maybe there was too much kind of focus on belief in the pilot and not reading the dashboard right, and someone else saying it's not right, and they're saying no, it's right, it's correct. So breaking into that kind of belief mindset requires a different sort of leadership culture. But I guess here, and kind of alluding to how people can get locked into a worldview which is wrong and unhelpful, and maybe even catastrophic sometimes. How that's emotional, and you need to break that down and create these sort of feedback loops, you know, with the data and the relationships all part of that.
The interesting thing is on that point is that if you look at a typical cockpit, you've got a lot of real-time information. So you're getting a lot of performance information from the engines, position information from the navigation systems, how the aircraft is being flown from the primary flight instruments, and that's, you know, it's very in the moment, and in some ways I think there's a parallel there with how we run lots of professional services firms. You know, we look at what we've done over the last month. It's very real, immediate, real time. The trick is, how do you actually analyze in the longer term what's gone before, which is back to your kind of safety culture comments, and secondly, you know, what planning and forward-looking data and information do you need? And the trick about flying is, actually flying in the moment is relatively simple, particularly simple when you're an autopilot. What's more difficult is planning for what's coming ahead and getting ahead of the aircraft. And I think that, you know, for me, that's the interesting thing that we can bring into professional services.
Really important. And how do you handle the defensiveness point? I know that in the professional services space there are real pressures, and there are also problems. There's always problems in organization around status. There's two ways of thinking about organization. One is about being well able to articulate sort of command control, and the other is I'm more important than you. And you always come with both those two lenses into a structure, and hierarchy just kind of offers the opportunity for status and empire building. But then also, when things go wrong, people can be very defensive about their space or about what happened, and just it can be difficult to get to the truth and reopen the communication. How do you and Ed tackle that in very busy, very pressured environment?
Well, I think the key thing is, and again, this is a good lesson for aviation, but the key thing is that you need to make a decision. Okay, so how you make the decision is where the magic is. But I think, you know, the thing I've learned from aviation is there are points where you have to make a decision, and procrastination, being paralyzed, just doesn't work. So the way we approach it is basically, we have a view, we have an opinion that's our own, but we then socialize those opinions. We get the group input to that, recognizing that we ultimately are responsible for taking the decision. And that's not dissimilar to a cockpit environment. It's about gathering as much information as you can in the time you've got available, but not being paralyzed by that. You've just got to get on and take a decision. The defensiveness piece is interesting. I mean, the whole aviation world is built around this idea that everyone wants to put positive feedback into the system so that they can learn from the mistakes that they've had. And I think that's that is something that we do, I think, probably quite badly in professional services organizations generally. I think that kind of briefing before things happen, debriefing after they've happened, that culture of kind of self-reporting of issues. You know, if I had an area I'd love to work on, it's just building much more of that kind of feedback loop so that we can learn from those experiences. But defensiveness is, I can only speak to the environments I've worked in, but I think law firms definitely have an environment where if there's ever a risk of a sort of negligence claim or a problem, they've always encouraged as much openness as possible about that. It's a non-judgmental approach to it, because fundamentally, from a risk management point of view, you need to get as much information out as possible. And there, but for the grace of God, I mean, everyone has their moments, and it's a natural part of running any kind of business. And the advisory world is no different.
Yeah, so actually sort of being open to that being, that could easily be me. So that you're starting from an empathic response and just going to sort of the risk for everybody for these things. Amazing. So just this slide, I kind of love what you had on your website. So I want to just get into the meat of this debate about, your point to me, which really struck a chord about strategy being maybe a straitjacket. I kind of captured this. I felt it was like maybe an identity kind of statement on your website. So, why do you think strategy can be a straitjacket, and what is it that you're seeking to solve that, the sort of a typical strategy process doesn't help with?
I think that the straitjacket comment really goes to how people think about strategy and implement it. So, having a strategy is not, straitjacket implies a negativity. I mean, having a strategy is clearly critical. I mean, it's probably been one of the key differentiators for us as a law firm over the years, certainly in the client arena and increasingly in the talent acquisition and retention arena. So I think strategy is positive. It's what you do with it, and there's the sense there is a sense that if you structurally think about strategy, so you have a written down strategy, you cascade it through an organization through individual objectives and detailed team plans. It's good at one level, but it's not the whole story, because at another level, people perform to the extent of their objective. And actually, what I'm saying is, if what you do is align people around a common sense of identity and direction and, much overused word, but purpose, you open up the opportunity for them to define their own potential and realize their own potential, and do that also at an organizational level. So that the general sentiment is, make sure there's enough space for creativity and fluidity in your organization. But that's not to say don't have a strategy.
Yeah, no, I think that's really powerful. So if I just tune back into that, do you think that the word purpose then, with all of that meaning, like I have a purpose, this firm has a purpose, I'm sharing the purpose. So that, for me, that's like the intersection of it all. So I express my identity through my activity, through my purpose, with this type of client, with this type of work, in this type of environment, with these people. So it feels like purpose is the intersectionality of it all. Is that right? Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I think it is, but probably where I would be cautious, and I don't think you're saying this, but I'd be cautious, is that the purpose isn't something that the organization in a governance sense should define, and then we should follow. We talk about being an identity-led business, and I think in our context that means recognizing that you're the sum of the purpose is the sum of everybody's passion. So what are you? The general principle is, what are you passionate about? If you focus on what you're passionate about, you'll do really well. If you do really well, you'll be more valuable in the market. If you're more valuable in the market, you'll be more successful as an organization. So it's that kind of flywheel approach. And Ed's a big fan of flywheels and spent a lot of time convincing me that flywheel is the right way to describe it. And I'm convinced now. But it's that essence of focusing on what you're passionate about. And that's very easy for someone on a podcast to sit and say, but actually it's about talking to people and really understanding that. And we've done that top to bottom in the organization regularly. And we've done it regularly because you also need to recognize that if you're identity led and you're the sum of the parts, then that's in essence going to be a dynamic thing, because the organization is changing all the time. So where we've landed is that we've you kind of have this relationship. So you find out what you're passionate about, and I'll come back to what we're passionate about. But if you find out what you're passionate about, that naturally attracts people who are also passionate about that. But you've got to balance it with the desire to be kind of diverse and inclusive in the broadest sense, because what you don't want to become is a one-track identity that never evolves.
Like a monoculture. You don't want to become a monoculture.
Exactly, and I think that's really so. It's a really positive area to think about, because it's something that is dynamic. you need to sort of intelligently challenge yourself around it all the time, and you need to keep listening to the organization to know how that's changing and evolving. But essentially, in our organization, what we found was, and I'm going back about 6 or 7 years now, but the phrase that came out was that we're passionate about making great things happen. And we ran with that for a while. And it sounds like marketing sort of phrase, but it wasn't. It actually came out. A number of people said it in a number of one-to-one interviews. But really, what that's about is we're more passionate about what our clients are achieving, particularly in the innovation space and how they're tackling some of the world's toughest challenges through innovation. We're more excited about that than we are about being a law firm. And again, it sounds a bit glib, but it does define who you are. And I think that's, we're passionate about being in the innovation ecosystem. That's our kind of purpose, being a catalyst, helping people innovate, helping tackle some of the world's toughest challenges. That's what gets people out of bed in the morning, and that's what attracts people to our organization. That is enshrined in our strategy. But actually what that means at a delivery level is much more fluid, and the more diverse the organization is, the more kind of strands of curiosity there are amongst the workforce and the staff and the stakeholders, and actually that's a really positive thing from a market perspective. It opens up so many more opportunities.
No, I think it's really powerful. It reminds me of a Harvard Business Review article that talked about, I think they were doing surveys on happiness, whether happiness orientated businesses had that edge in terms of, impact, productivity, value add, whatever it might be. And they did a massive survey on happiness, and the conclusion was that happiness businesses are happier. But they're not necessarily more productive. The ones that were more productive were combining an orientation around happiness and also really powerful purpose. And it was the combination of those two things, feeling really purposeful and feeling really happy in your role, were clear factors in improving value add. So what you're saying really reminds me of that. It really resonates. So I think I understand that, what you're saying is you need that strategy. You need like going back to the cockpit, you need the clear parameters, you need all the fuel in the engine, you need to know where you're going, all that kind of good stuff. You need the controls to all work. But then there's another part of it, isn't it, which is why are we going here? And that's more the human side of it. And what's this journey going to be like for us? What are we going to do when we get there? And I do think that a lot of professionals, they're very motivated around their tools, the expertise within their particular niche of the law, to a certain point, that is always going to be motivating, but it's what do you do with those tools, right? And I think also there's a really big thing in professionals around helping people. And so for me, your point about achieving amazing things, I don't think that's the right phrase, but something along those lines, achieving great things, seeing clients with that vicarious sense of success, I think that's very motivational for a lot of professionals. And that's why you're there, isn't it, to help people in the end?
Yeah, so it's interesting. A couple of thoughts you were saying that. I mean, identity is, when I talk about identity, I don't just mean the identity of the people that work in Taylor Winters. I think it's the identity of the clients, it's the identity of the stakeholders and broader partners that we work with that defines that identity. And you're right. I mean, we do, in professional services, we do often focus on our service lines and our products. And from a strategy point of view, you can make anything look good on paper. From a service line and product point of view, you can be, particularly if you're in the world of being adversarial, you can convince yourself and others around you that that's the right way to go. But essentially, that's about what you're selling. It's not about what people are buying. And I think the other part of the journey over the last X number of years has been recognizing that actually focusing more on how people buy things rather than how successful organizations sell things is really, really insightful, and it's much more human-centered, and it leads you to to your point, to an experience-based strategy. So, when I think about how I want it to be inside our firm, but also to work with our firm as a customer, I'm more interested in the experience than I am in the product line, because frankly, everyone needs something different. I mean, we've got some pegs to hang what we do on, but increasingly everything is different. So the experience is much more important. And the crossover is, and this is another one of the kind of observations. I say it a lot. I would be interested to be challenged around it, but I think I believe it, which is that if you get the employee experience right, you get the customer experience right. And I think, you know, there are a lot of industries where I'm seeing that HR and business development function get closer and closer. Or put another way, I don't think you can guarantee a successful customer experience if you're having a terrible employee experience. So you have to work on both sides of that equation.
I think that's completely correct, Matt. I'm not going to challenge you on that at all. One of our approaches is to ask if you can track the smile all the way through the organization to the point of contact with the customer, and so whoever that might be. So in a restaurant, it might be the cleaner, which is an old economics kind of adage about the, you know, clean restaurant, horrible meal, great meal, dirty restaurant, you know, which one's most important. But, you know, we have a lot of clients who are doing deliveries, and, you know, and if the delivery driver turns up really fed up because they haven't had the tools, or they've been delayed, there's been problems at work, you know, they show up grouchy, and that affects them, and they're careless, or they have that mood, and that's the customer's experience, right? So can you trace the smile through the organization is a really lovely way of saying, okay, you know, how are we passing things through the process seamlessly to create that sense of positivity? I think it's a really powerful idea. I've got
I think the crux of what we've been talking about is the idea that it is strategy, but it's more that don't let structure become a distraction. You know, it's the real magic in organizations, and I see this in, you know, we're blessed to work with these really creative, innovative organizations. The most important things that seem to happen are the things that happen around the edges of the strategy, in spite of the strategy, between human beings solving things that were never in their objectives. And I think what I'm suggesting is that we just need to be really conscious to allow that fluidity, that curiosity, and those things to happen, and not you know, simply measure people's contribution by reference to the structural implementation of a strategy.
Yeah, so I'm gonna just pause there for a second and say hi also to Mark Turner. I've got some questions coming into the questions box, which we just share in a second. Thank you, Matt, for your question. Really happy to take questions for a few minutes. So just kind of sum up, I think, what we got to with that, which I think what you're saying is the strategy is essential, and it's setting context, it's setting parameters, it's kind of organizing resources. But rather than a straitjacket, you want that, once you set the parameters, you want it also to be open to the human experience. And so therefore to come alive in a way. So it's how do you take it off the paper and make it come alive and be a journey to the beach for a picnic is maybe a good way of putting it, rather than a strategy for a picnic, you know, which sounds really dull. So it's just, I think that's what you're saying, and that really resonates with me. I think it's fabulous. So just a couple of quick slides, and then we'll get on to just answering some of these questions. So we are just kind of tuning in for our dates over the summer, just thinking about exactly when we're going to do this. But delighted to have Dr. Kirsten Dunlop on Strategy Café coming up in the next month or so. She is head of Climate KIC. She's really incredible leader, and her team's job is to make change at institutional and citywide levels to adapt rapidly to climate change. So it's some really, really deep systemic partnerships for change. So fascinating, very, very big level strategy stuff, and a really amazing lady to listen to. And then also we're going to do another session from the team. I think everyone's really enjoyed our team strategy cafes, and very open to ideas from you listening today about what you'd like us to cover. We've covered a load of topics about coming out of lockdown, how to manage hybrid, all that kind of stuff, and you can see all of those on our website. If you want to go back and review all those things. But any ideas you've got for us to tackle and talk about and give you tips on and engage in conversation around, we'd be really delighted to do that. So we'll come back to you all with dates for the next session and content for the next session, and just feedback any ideas that you've got for us. So I've got a couple of great questions here. So first of all, Alice is talking about the Mark Gallagher presentation about Formula One. You know, in the cockpit talking, the black box thinking, which is Matt Syed, I think. Just give him a proper reference. It's a great book. You know, drawing the similarities. And then Matt's question to Matt: how can you find out about what the purpose and identity of stakeholders is?
Yeah, great question, and probably the lawyer's answer is we've got to work out who the stakeholders are, and they might all be different. But yeah, fundamentally, it's about conversation, isn't it? I mean, I think the longer I get in the tooth, you know, any group that I work with, clients, staff, partners, other stakeholders, it's actually having authentic, kind of deep conversations with people and really getting a sense of what their value system is. I think you can, you know, you can do that formally. I've found people really receptive to having that conversation. And once you can get beyond the business development expression of that purpose, or values-based kind of documents and things like that, and actually have a conversation about who the stakeholders are, who the leaders are, and what makes them. People are pretty receptive to that. So, no clever answer. I think it's just making the time to have conversations with people. That's always been good business in my experience.
I would also just maybe observe, and just interested in your thoughts on this. I think you can tell. So if we're talking about relationships, and you had a really fabulous conversation earlier on about you and Ed, and that's starting with not knowing each other so well, not knowing exactly how it was going to work, and then in the end becoming a really organic, deep relationship where you just know each other really well, and quite fluid in how you manage things. That human aspect of relationships, like the relational side of things, is energetic, and we can sense that, right? And so if a stakeholder is buying in to the identity of the organization, that is a direct analog for buying shares. And if they're not, that's in a way a direct analog for wanting to sell the shares. So if we're talking about the valuation of a business, that's driven by demand, and you can tell people want to buy the shares, they don't want to buy the shares. So that's fundamental to what to what's driving the value. It's the emotion rather than just the fundamentals. So to our whole conversation about strategy versus the power and feeling of the people, it's actually the power and feeling of the people which you can't really kind of put your fingers on. As much as the strategy sets the context, it's putting the energy in the pack, I think, that drives all of that. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, at the end of the day, everything gets done around a human connection. Everything, the success or failure of most projects rests on the strength of human relationships, I find. So, the nearer you can, the things you can do to get closer to that, the better. And the nice thing is that you're often surprised, and normally positively surprised, has been my experience. If you just let your guard down and talk to people and be receptive, and that's it's interesting. We started with a bit of breathing. I mean, I think you have to be in the right state of mind, to do these things well, to be really open and receptive, and people. I'm no psychologist or scientist, but there's a whole world of research out there, isn't there, on the sort of cues that you give people and the way that they respond to them, either consciously or unconsciously. And I think that actually, if you see your role as being about forming those human connections rather than trying to sell X, Y, and Z or achieve ABC KPI, my experience has been that that's the best place to start, and everything else follows from it. It rarely goes the other way.
Yeah, I've got this weird idea. I think it's probably correct, but I've got this weird idea from the neuroscience that I know, that our neural pathways are represented in relationships. So when, like you and Ed, for example, I would say there's probably a really strong neurology of your relationship, which is a bit of a weird comment, so forgive me if it makes you feel slightly creepy, but like in your head, there's a sense of the shape of that relationship because it's in fluid memory. So it's muscle memory, if you like, is another way of describing it, which means it's body neurological, and it's deeply habitual after a while, and it just flows. So I really feel that that's true, and I think so. One of the ways we sort of work to improve leadership teams is to sometimes you perceive the relationship between people as a really small thread. So you could see that as a really limited set of good neural connections, and the habit of the pathway of that relationship is poor because the communication is difficult, negative, etc. And so one way to deal with that is to change the way that they are in relationship with each other and increase the number of connections, and then gradually you get a powerful new channel there, which becomes a new way of being with each other. And you have to sort of do the practice and the experience. But I think to your point, you need to be open to that and really open to the practice of it. practice of creating relationships.
I think in the context of a two-person leadership team, and well, even a broader board and wider leadership team, but fundamentally, I think Ed and I would say that a core part of our role is making sure that each other is as effective as they can be. We sort of got each other's backs. That comes from a trust and respect and to your point, learned experience of what works and what doesn't work. But that has to be the starting point. And I guess the particular challenge you find in many professional advice practices, and I'm sure everywhere else, is the sort of the assumption that actually to get on you need to be competitive. You don't. To get on, you need to support other people. And I don't want to drift into too many cliches, but I do think actually empowering other people, getting great people around you, supporting them is definitely the way to succeed personally and organisationally.
Yeah, that's a really powerful point. Thank you very much. I'm just going to say hi to Kim, who joined late on, and wonder whether you have a question to Matt while we have him here. We're running up against the time now, and I'm going to wrap up in a second, but I think I've got one more question. Okay, this one's a question to me. What is the most significant thing that I bring from my life experience outside of a work context which helps me? Gosh, interesting question. I'd say probably trying to tune into what Matt was saying earlier on. I think Matt said right at the top of the session, which is probably where this has come from, that about the whole person, bringing the whole of you to work, which doesn't mean work all the time, but in some ways does, because maybe you just open to the whole of your life experience. So that's one thing I would respond by, but I think that I bring in everything from every corner and nook and cranny of life if it's helpful. And I've been lucky enough to have such a wide-ranging experience that all of it is useful at some point. So I definitely have a kind of a, what have I got in the toolkit that could be helpful here? And then before we started this morning, we were talking a little bit about experiences, Matt and I, and I can't remember why it came out, but I happened to talk about my mum dying and my experience of the shock and the grief of that. And not wanting to go there too much, but I think my reflective learning on that was I don't know. And it really shifted me very strongly from certainties to uncertainties, but in a good way. I think it helped me stay much more open when I see a situation. I think I learned that I knew I could cope with things, that were tough. So that gave me a sense of confidence and resilience. But I also knew that I didn't know how it was going to be, and I just needed to wait and see. So I think being open to the information that's coming in and waiting and seeing has been a really profound thing for me, which unfortunately comes through things happening. So being older, I suppose. Let's just see if there's any more questions. That's it. So thank you very much, Matt. I've loved talking to you this morning. It's been fabulous. I could take 35 or so clips out of that and just come back and listen to them again and again. Thank you so much for sharing the richness of your leadership experience with everyone this morning. It's been really super.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to reflect. I think it's great to have these opportunities just to sit back and have a think about what's going on and try and articulate it out loud.
Well, you articulated it really well, so thank you very much. I hope you have a fabulous time in Italy. I know you're working, so but thank you for tuning in. And it's the modern world. It's very nice. Works really well. So I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to catching up again soon. Thank you everyone for tuning in this morning. We're going to wrap up there. The video will be recorded and it will be up on our podcast, and it will be on our YouTube channel. So those of you who tuned in a little bit late and want to hear the earlier part, you'll be able to access that a little bit later on today. And we'll see you next time on Strategy Cafe. Bye, everyone.